She never wore a cape, never raised her voice, and never asked for praise. Emily Daniels walked through life quietly, patching scrubs at the elbow, offering soup on cold Saturdays, staying after hours for patients no one remembered. But one winter night, when danger loomed in a snow-covered street, she did what heroes do. She stepped forward. No camera, no crowd, no backup, just courage. What she didn't know was that the man she saved held secrets that reached the highest levels of government, and what began as an act of quiet compassion would ripple all the way to the White House. This is not a story about fame. It's a story about character, about how the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of lives, including your own. Emily Daniels had never been the type to draw attention. At 26, she moved through life quietly, like the hush of snow that blanketed Pine Hill every winter. She was still working toward her nursing certification, splitting her days, and too often her nights, between shifts as a trainee at Pine Hill Regional Medical Center. The hospital was modest, much like the town itself. It had scuffed linoleum floors, ancient vending machines, and posters about flu shots that peeled at the corners. Yet it served a community of people who, like Emily, lived without much and asked for even less. Retirees, veterans, single mothers, factory workers, the invisible people. Emily fit there not just because she came from them, but because she understood what it meant to be overlooked. She had grown up just a few miles from the hospital, in a one-bedroom home that always smelled of peppermint tea and antiseptic. Her mother, Marie Daniels, was a hospice nurse, resilient, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who would sit at a patient's bedside long after the machines went quiet, never once needing to be asked. Marie didn't have much to give her daughter except love, a strong back, and an unshakable sense of duty. You show up, not for applause, but because someone needs you. Emily took that lesson and stitched it into the fabric of who she was. She didn't own a car, she couldn't afford one. Her apartment, located above an abandoned laundromat on Main Street, rattled through the nights with the clanking of a tired radiator. Her couch sagged in the middle, her coat had been patched twice at the elbows, and yet, every other Saturday, she showed up to serve soup at the local shelter. She smiled at everyone the same, whether they were holding a clipboard or a cane. At the hospital, Emily remembered the names no one else did. The elderly woman terrified of being alone at night, Emily would pull up a chair, hold her hand, and wait until sleep settled in. The veteran who never had visitors, she carved out time just to sit beside him. When a coworker arrived drenched from the rain, she offered her own winter boots without hesitation. When the janitors worked late, she brought them coffee. These were not tasks listed in her job description, but for Emily, kindness wasn't transactional, it was instinctual. Her supervisors never promised her a permanent spot, but they quietly leaned on her, especially during the long, frantic nights. She was the extra hands when too many patients came in, the calm presence when panic spread, the one who stayed behind, never asking when her own shift would end. Still, the truth was, she was worn down, tired of stretching every paycheck to the breaking point, tired of watching others climb while she stayed stuck at the bottom rung. Her account often dipped below zero, but somehow she never stopped showing up. To Emily, compassion wasn't something you saved for special occasions. It was something you lived, day after day. And then came that night. The shift had dragged on, as it often did. Nearly midnight when she finally stepped out of the hospital, her stethoscope still dangling around her neck, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder. The air was bitter, cutting through her coat like glass. Snow fell in delicate flurries, catching in her hair, layering the sidewalks in a thin, crisp sheet. The street lamps blinked sporadically, throwing long, distorted shadows across the narrow road. She hadn't made it far when she heard it. Raised voices, cutting through the silence like broken glass. Under one of the flickering streetlights, 3 men had cornered an elderly man, his back pressed against the brick wall, his hands trembling. Emily didn't hesitate. She didn't think of her own safety. She didn't consider the odds. She just stepped forward. What happened next was a blur of motion and fear. A shout. A blow. The world spun. The pavement rose to meet her. And then, nothing. When she opened her eyes again, the world was washed in sterile light and the beep of monitors. The hospital room was familiar. She'd spent so many nights tending to others there. But this time the whispers were about her. Her name spoken softly down hallways she used to walk. Flowers she couldn't afford sat on the windowsill. Cards signed by hands she didn't know. And one of the voices came from a man in a dark suit. He wasn't just anyone. The president knew what had happened. What Emily didn't yet understand was that the man she tried to protect, the one pressed against the wall on that freezing night, was not just some frail stranger. He was someone with a story far more complicated and far more consequential than she could have imagined. Her quiet act of bravery would ripple far beyond the snowy streets of Pine Hill. It would shatter the fragile walls of her anonymous life and force a spotlight on a woman who had spent her entire life avoiding it. Emily Daniels never set out to be a hero. She simply showed up again and again. But sometimes the world notices the quiet ones, especially when they do something unforgettable. Emily never minded walking home down Main Street, even late at night. She could have called someone for a ride. There were plenty of nurses who would have gladly swung by, but she never did. Over the years, walking became a quiet ritual, a way to ease her mind after long shifts at the hospital. It helped her save money, yes, but more than that, it gave her a rare pocket of silence, time to breathe out the noise and pressure that clung to her like hospital disinfectant. Pine Hill was never exactly lively, but at this hour the streets felt practically abandoned. Just the soft hum of a vending machine, buzzing outside the shuttered gas station, and the steady squeak of her worn boots against the damp concrete kept her company. She had just passed the old community church, its steeple buried under a fresh blanket of snow, when the sound of raised voices pierced the silence, rough, low, and slurred. At first she thought it might just be a drunken argument. Not uncommon, but when she rounded the corner and saw what was really happening, she stopped dead. Three men were huddled beneath a flickering street lamp, their dark silhouettes pressing together like shadows with too much menace. In the middle of them stood an elderly man, frail, wrapped in a thin, tattered coat, his shaking hands clutching a crumpled paper bag like it was the only thing he had left in the world. One of the younger men shoved him hard in the chest, and the old man stumbled, crashing against the brick wall slick with ice. Another one grabbed at his sleeve, yelling something Emily couldn't quite hear, but the tone told her everything. She froze, her breath catching somewhere between her chest and throat. Her whole body screamed at her to keep moving. Cross the street, pretend she didn't see anything. But Emily Daniels had never been the kind of person to look away, not from suffering, not from fear, not from someone who needed help. "Hey!" Her voice rang out, sharper than she meant it. "Leave him alone!" The men turned as one. The tallest of them stepped forward, a dark knit cap pulled low over his greasy hair, a patchy beard framing his sneer. He looked amused, the kind of look men wore when they didn't think someone like her, a woman alone in scrubs and a puffy jacket, could ever be a threat. "Keep walking, nurse lady," he slurred. "Ain't none of your business." Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she could hear it in her ears. Still, she didn't move back. Instead, she took a step forward, her voice firmer this time. "He didn't do anything to you. Let him go." One of the men closest to the old man let out a cruel chuckle, low and bitter. "What are you gonna do, sweetheart? Patch us up after?" Another barked a laugh, stepping forward. She didn't have time to answer. Without warning, one of them shoved her, hard. Her boots slipped on the icy curb, her shoulder hit the side of a dumpster with a dull thud, and then the pavement rushed up to meet her. Her head slammed against it with a sickening crack. The street lamp above flared, and her vision fractured with it, blooming in white halos. She could taste blood in her mouth. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't respond. Everything around her warped. Footsteps echoed. A faraway shout rang out, followed by frantic breathing. And then it all went silent. The men were gone. The old man, too. Only the cold remained, seeping up through the sidewalk, through her clothes, through her bones. She lay there blinking slowly, snow falling in lazy spirals above her. She might have slipped into the dark completely, if not for the man across the street. He'd just locked up his bookstore for the night, his arms full of receipts and keys, when he heard the commotion. At first he figured it was just some drunks yelling. Pine Hill had its fair share. But then he saw someone lying in the street. He ran. "Miss, miss, can you hear me?" he called, kneeling beside her. She blinked once, faintly, then her eyes rolled back. His hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, dialing 911, his voice rising in panic. "She's hurt, head wound, bleeding, unconscious. Please, you've got to get here fast." He slipped out of his coat and draped it gently over her body, trying to block the wind. He lifted her head just slightly off the pavement, trying not to move her too much, whispering reassurances to someone who couldn't respond. The sirens arrived barely 2 minutes later, wailing through the narrow streets. The ambulance skidded to a halt in front of the bookstore, lights painting red and blue across the snow-covered sidewalks. Paramedics from Pine Hill Regional rushed out. One of them paused in shock mid-stride. "It's Emily," he whispered. Everyone there knew her. She was the nurse who never stopped moving, always had a chart in her hand, always showed up. But now she was the one being lifted onto the stretcher. Unconscious, blood dripping down from her temple, her breath shallow. "She's one of ours," someone said, quiet and reverent. And as the ambulance doors shut and the vehicle sped off into the snowy night, no one yet knew that the man she tried to protect, an old stranger on a lonely street, would not vanish quietly. The man she tried to shield had once worn the proud uniform of a United States Marine, and now a single phone call had been made, one that would shift the course of everything. The ambulance doors burst open with a sharp hiss, slicing through the stillness of the night. For a heartbeat, the world outside the emergency room stopped turning. Inside the sterile white cocoon of the vehicle, a voice barked out urgently. "Head trauma, female mid-20s, GCS falling fast." The paramedics were already moving before the words finished hanging in the air. When the stretcher rolled into the hospital's fluorescent light, the silence inside was pierced not by noise, but by recognition. Someone gasped. A nurse's pen clattered to the floor. A whisper followed, fragile and immediate, sweeping like a wave down the corridor. "That's Emily." Not Emily the patient, Emily Daniels. She wasn't just another name scribbled onto the trauma board. She was one of their own. She had walked these halls for years, quiet and consistent, not known for making a scene, but for making a difference. She brewed coffee at midnight for the overworked residents, sat extra hours beside patients with no visitors, even helped mop up spills without being asked. She never sought attention. She simply showed up, with her hands, with her heart. And now she lay still beneath the blinding trauma lights. Blood oozed steadily from a deep gash near her temple. Her jaw hung loose, her breath ragged and shallow. Monitors blinked and screamed. The sight of her made Dr. Khaled's stomach turn. He had seen countless traumas in his years, but never one that made his fingers tremble on the penlight. "Get neuro on standby. I want vitals every 60 seconds, he snapped, low but firm. His voice cut through the shock, spurring the team into practiced, desperate motion. Nurses inserted IVs, hands swift but gentle. A tech cut away her soaked scrubs. The respiratory therapist adjusted the airway tube. Machines hummed and beeped around her, each sound a reminder of how close she stood to the edge. The thread tying her to this world felt impossibly thin. Outside the trauma room, people began to appear. First Rachel, a night nurse, her eyes already welling. Years ago, Emily had split her sandwich with her when she'd forgotten to bring lunch. Then Leo, the janitor, who still remembered how Emily slipped him cough drops during a vicious flu season. Maria came next, the cafeteria manager whose daughter Emily once tutored in algebra during short breaks between shifts. None of them had been called. They just came. They gathered silently in the narrow hallway, shoulder to shoulder, forming a quiet vigil. There were no grand gestures, only presence. Steady, reverent presence. People who had been seen by Emily, heard by her, cared for by her when the world had passed them by. Inside, the trauma bay worked like a symphony of urgency. Nurses moved without hesitation. Blood suctioned, saline flushed. Her name was repeated not with clinical detachment, but with hope and grief braided together. "Emily, come on. You're not done yet. You've carried us. Let us carry you now." Between orders and medical jargon came memories, spoken in hushed voices between chest compressions and lab updates. One nurse remembered the night Emily quietly offered to cover her shift so she could be with her son during surgery. An orderly recalled how she slipped him her last $5 bill for dinner. Someone murmured about a time she hand-stitched a blanket for a newborn whose mother had no family. Her kindness had been quiet, invisible almost, but it had threaded them together. Now, in her stillness, that thread was what held them there, trying to catch her before she slipped through the seams. At the end of the corridor, a man sat alone on a hard plastic chair. His coat was too thin for the night's chill. His hands, scarred and strong, were folded tightly in his lap. No one asked who he was. No one told him to move. There was something in his silence, a weight, a sorrow, a kind of reverence that made others instinctively lower their voices around him. They didn't know his name, not yet, but in the set of his shoulders, the haunted look in his eyes, there was a history. A man shaped by war, scarred by violence, and stunned that someone so small, so gentle, had ever thought he was worth saving. And she had saved him, somehow. The trauma team didn't pause. The CT results came back. Skull fracture, subdural bleed. The next step was clear: neurosurgery. As they prepared to wheel her away, Rachel leaned in. Her fingers reached for Emily's hand, cold, motionless, but still faintly alive, a fragile spark beneath the skin. "You're not leaving us, Emily," she whispered. "Not tonight, not on our watch." And just like that, the trauma bay doors swung open again. The hallway filled with the rush of footsteps, the whirl of wheels, the roar of hope wrapped in urgency. Emily was stepping into a new chapter of the fight, not just hers anymore, but one that belonged to every life she had quietly touched over the years without asking for thanks or recognition. Somewhere in the sterile silence of the ICU waiting room, a man sat alone. He hadn't spoken in hours. The old man's hands were laced tightly together, his back straight, despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his bones. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, his boots scuffed from time and travel, but nothing about him seemed broken. There was discipline in his every motion. It wasn't only the way he held himself, it was in the silence he respected, the patience with which he waited, and the way his presence seemed to anchor the air around him. Nobody knew his name, only that he had been there when Emily Daniels fell. When the neurosurgeon finally emerged with an update, stable for now, but still extremely fragile, the man didn't ask questions or react loudly. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if speaking a quiet prayer to someone who was no longer around. Then, with the care of a soldier handling something sacred, he rose to his feet and walked outside. No one stopped him. Outside in the chilled air, away from the bright hospital lights, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, cracked flip phone, the kind that had long since disappeared from most people's lives. He opened it, pressed a number with practiced certainty, a number he hadn't dialed in years. It rang twice before a clipped, official voice answered. "Operations Command, who's calling?" "This is Colonel Henry Keene," he said. His voice didn't waver. "Authorization Bravo Zulu Echo 3. I need to speak to Director Pierce. Tell him it's about a civilian nurse and about me." There was a pause, then silence. And when the line returned, the voice that answered was older, slower, and sharper than a blade honed over decades. "Colonel Keene, it's been a long time." "I need a favor," Keene replied. "You were never one to ask." "I know," he admitted, "but this one matters. She's in critical condition because she stepped in when no one else did. She saved me from a beating. Maybe worse." A heavy pause. "What's her name?" "Emily Daniels." Within 15 minutes, a secure message was sent from Fort Belvoir. 10 minutes after that, someone inside the West Wing was fully briefed. And just before dawn, a black, unmarked SUV with tinted windows and government plates was silently making its way to Piney Hill Regional Medical Center. Inside the waiting room, Henry Keene had returned to his seat, but this time his posture had shifted, his elbows resting on his knees, shoulders heavy, breath shallow. His mind was far away, because Henry Keene wasn't just another old man sleeping rough or living off grid. He had once been a decorated Marine colonel. He had led men through the unforgiving terrain of Kandahar, drafted tactical protocols still used by embassy protection teams, and for 6 straight years had guarded the President of the United States as part of an elite White House security force. He had stood in underground war rooms the public didn't even know existed, held the hands of fallen comrades, briefed heads of state, And now the man who had walked among world leaders owed his life to a young nurse who hadn't known his name and wouldn't have cared if she had. The military had taught him discipline, strategy, silence. It had taught him loyalty that outlasted pain. But it was Emily's raw, instinctive courage that had shaken him the most. She hadn't acted for rank or recognition. She simply did what was right, because no one else did. And Henry Keene understood something most people didn't. When someone like that steps forward, the entire nation ought to rise with them. By the time the black SUV rolled to a stop in the parking lot, the snow had long stopped falling. There was no sound but the muted crunch of salt under tires. No flashing lights, no sirens, just one vehicle and its purpose. A man in a dark gray suit stepped out. He wasn't especially tall, but he moved with a quiet urgency that didn't invite questions. His coat was sharply tailored, his shoes spotless. Tucked beneath his arm was a worn leather folder, sealed inside a navy envelope stamped with a golden federal crest. He didn't stop at reception, didn't ask for directions. He walked straight through the hospital, heading toward the administrator's office with the kind of focus that made even security hesitate and step aside. 10 minutes later, Dr. Khaled, still in his scrubs, knocked gently on the ICU door before stepping inside. Emily Daniels lay there, her body pale against the sterile linens, head slightly propped. Tubes monitored her heartbeat and machines whispered in rhythmic pulses. But her eyes were beginning to open, slowly, steadily, quietly returning to the light. Her breath came in short, careful draws. Rachel sat close beside her, her hand resting gently on Emily's forearm, grounding her, anchoring her to this unfamiliar moment. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice low and full of relief. "You're back." Emily blinked, trying to focus. The lights felt too bright, the room too still, the voices too far away. Each detail slowly registered, the white sheets, the IV line, the quiet hum of machines. Then, from the doorway, another figure emerged. Colonel Henry Keene. Gone was the battered coat she remembered from that terrible night. He now wore a clean military-style shirt, and though his steps were slow, he stood tall, hands clasped behind his back. His face carried a solemn gravity that seemed to pull the air taut around him. He stopped just a foot from her bed, his voice calm and measured. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "Not really, but I know you." Emily wanted to respond, but her throat was parched. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Confused, she blinked again. "I failed once," Keene continued, his voice steady and soft. "I failed to protect people, in a place where protecting others was supposed to be my only job. I've carried that with me for years." His gaze didn't waver. "But that night, you didn't. You didn't hesitate. You stepped in. You saved me. A man you didn't know, a man who didn't look like he was worth saving." Emily's lips parted again, but the words still wouldn't come. Keene offered a small, almost wistful smile. "You reminded me what honor truly looks like." Behind him, another figure entered the room silently. A man in a dark suit, Agent Nathan Pierce, stepped forward and handed a sealed folder to the attending nurse. She passed it carefully to Rachel, who opened it and placed it gently in Emily's trembling hands. Emily looked down. Her name was printed at the top of the document in bold, precise black ink. Emily Grace Daniels. Just her name. No titles, no ranks, no labels, not Miss, not trainee, just her. Below it, in crisp lettering, was an official request, an invitation from the President of the United States. And under that, a single sentence that made her breath catch. "The nation has not forgotten you." Her fingers brushed over the raised presidential seal at the top of the page. The paper was heavy, expensive, so unlike the world she came from. Yet there it was, her name, her recognition. She hadn't said a word since receiving the folder. Her voice was still faint, but the silence didn't come from pain. It came from disbelief. Rachel, still at her side, quietly held out a glass of water. Emily had forgotten she was thirsty. Colonel Keene moved to the window, his posture straight, arms crossed behind his back like he had resumed a post. Agent Pierce remained still, watching with the quiet patience of someone who had seen moments like this unfold in private, sacred silence. History made not in parades, but in hospital rooms. Finally, Emily looked up, her voice barely a whisper. Is this real? Pierce gave a single steady nod. The president read your full report this morning. He asked that it be delivered in person. Emily looked down again, rereading the paragraph. Once, twice, a third time. You have been a light in dark places, not just to one man, but to all those you've served. In recognition of your courage and compassion, I am formally inviting you to accept the position of honorary head nurse of the White House Medical Wing. This appointment carries full benefits, relocation support, and a permanent role serving those who serve our nation. Tucked inside the folder was another letter, smaller, handwritten, folded with care. Emily opened it carefully. The handwriting was elegant but earnest. Dear Ms. Daniels, I don't know where people like you find the strength to stand up when it would be so much easier to look away. But because you did, you reminded every one of us what character truly means. We need more of that in Washington. We need more of you. Welcome home. The President. Emily's vision blurred. Tears welled up, her chest tightening with the weight of it all. Rachel leaned closer, brushing a stray strand of hair from Emily's forehead with tenderness. You did this, she murmured, her voice thick with pride, just by being who you are. There's more, Agent Pierce said gently, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a small envelope, opened it, and placed a set of keys in Emily's hand. They were simple keys, unmarked, plain, except for a small silver tag engraved with a house number. A furnished townhouse in Arlington, he explained, mortgage-free. A vehicle is included, yours outright, and you'll receive lifetime VA medical coverage under special civilian provisions. Emily stared at the keys in her palm. Her whole life she had lived one step behind, barely making rent, walking miles in worn shoes, holding on to a job in a town that offered little more than survival. She had never dared to imagine anything beyond that. And now this, a home, a future. Not because she demanded it, not because she chased it, but because she acted when it mattered most. And the world somehow had taken notice. The hospital room faded into silence again. But this time it wasn't the quiet of uncertainty, it was the hush that follows something sacred. And Emily, still holding the keys, still trying to breathe through the whirlwind of it all, finally let herself believe. She climbed those stairs one last time, her footsteps slow, almost reverent. Her apartment, nestled above the old laundromat on Main Street in Pine Hills, welcomed her with a scent that wrapped around her like an old sweater. Brewed tea, aged wood, the essence of a quiet life, gently lived. She paused at the door, fingers resting on the chipped brass knob, eyes drifting to the familiar scratch marks just beneath the lock, marks from all the times her keys had fumbled and missed. They were small, but they were hers, just like everything inside. The space hadn't changed. The thrift store armchair still sat angled by the window, its fabric faded but soft from years of use. The tiny kettle remained perched on the stove, ready to scream louder than any kettle ought to, and the mismatched mugs, one chipped, one floral, one bearing a faded cartoon, lay drying neatly on a towel by the sink. As she stepped inside, she moved slowly, as if afraid to startle the memories tucked into every corner. Her eyes traced each object, every detail holding weight. Nothing in this place had been expensive or curated. It was a patchwork of things found, gifted, or rescued. But it was hers, a life stitched together piece by piece. Into her worn canvas duffel, she carefully folded the set of scrubs she'd worn through 3 years of night shifts and hard lessons. She laid her stethoscope atop them, its tubing slightly worn, the chest piece still cold from the last time she used it. There wasn't much else to pack. A few books she'd never quite had time to finish. Some framed photos, her grandmother smiling under a sun hat, a Polaroid of the soup kitchen Christmas party, a candid of her and a young boy in the hospital playroom. The patchwork quilt her mother had sewn during her final months of chemo was folded gently, like a prayer. It didn't take long, and yet, with every drawer she slid shut, something inside her ached. Each closing felt like a goodbye whispered too quietly to be heard, but too heavy to ignore. Before she left the town she had come to call home, she made one final stop. The soup kitchen buzzed with its usual rhythm, the clang of ladles against steel pots, the low murmur of conversation, the hiss and spit of steam rising from the big back burner. Nothing had changed here, but as soon as she stepped through the door, everything paused. Heads turned, silence swept in, then a sudden burst of life. "Emily!" cried a small voice. A blur of movement, then arms wrapped tightly around her waist. Emily stumbled slightly, bag nearly slipping from her shoulder as a child's laughter bubbled against her ribs. Then came more. Volunteers rushed from behind the counter. Guests stood from their meals. Children wove between chairs to reach her. It was as though the room had been holding its breath and now, finally, could exhale. Mrs. Kellerman, the director, was next. Her hug was fierce, like someone holding on to a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. "I heard, sweet girl," she whispered, her voice thick. "We all did. You're going to do so much good." Emily's voice was soft, uncertain. "I wasn't trying to do anything big." Mrs. Kellerman pulled back, eyes shining. "That's exactly why it was." They ate together, a meal humble and warm. Someone passed her a crayon drawing, a sun with a smiling face, a crooked heart, and her name written in big block letters. A man with a kind face and rough hands pressed something into her palm, closing her fingers around it gently. A tiny silver cross. "For protection," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Like you gave us." Later, as she walked back home, snow began to fall again, feather-light and soundless. Her mind wandered, stringing together moments like a reel of quiet film. Holding the trembling hand of a teenager in the ER whose eyes wouldn't stop darting to the door. Slipping a coffee into the hands of the night janitor when no one else even saw him. Humming softly to a dementia patient whose mind had long since drifted away. Reading a fairy tale to a child whose mother lay in surgery down the hall. Offering her coat to a woman standing in the rain at a bus stop who had no umbrella and only one shoe. None of those moments had been posted or praised or published, but they had been remembered, in hearts, not headlines. When she stepped back into her apartment for the final time and closed the door, the space felt transformed. Not emptier, fuller, as if the air itself had absorbed every laugh, every tear, every late-night thought. She placed a handwritten note on the small motto by the window. It read simply, "Leave it better than you found it. That's all that matters." Then Emily Daniels turned, opened the door, and stepped out into the falling snow. She walked not toward the unknown, but into a future she hadn't dared imagine. And yet, she didn't leave anything behind, not really, because she carried it all with her. The air in Washington was different. It had weight, formality. Even the breeze seemed to move with purpose. Standing just at the edge of the White House garden, Emily wore a fitted navy coat, her hair pulled back into a neat, no-nonsense knot. Beneath the layers, her heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from something deeper, a kind of reverent disbelief. White folding chairs stretched it in long rows across the manicured lawn, filled with faces she didn't recognize. Cabinet members in tailored suits, military officers in crisp uniforms, doctors and nurses in formal dress. Behind them, tulips and roses bloomed along meticulously trimmed hedges. The beauty was staggering, but it wasn't what held the crowd's attention. All eyes were drawn to the podium at the south lawn. "Ready?" a quiet voice asked beside her. She turned. Colonel Henry Keene stood tall, his frame still carrying the quiet authority of a soldier. His suit was sharp, his shoulders squared, but the look in his eyes was softer now, steadier. They were the same eyes she'd seen filled with fear once in a hospital corridor lit too brightly, echoing with the sound of something breaking. Today they held pride. "Not really," she admitted, a breath of truth escaping her lips. He smiled faintly. "That's the right answer." Then a hush rippled through the crowd like wind across wheat. Attention shifted, heads turned. The president had arrived. He walked toward the podium with a calm, practiced ease, the hush growing stiller. As he paused to take in the sea of faces before him, his gaze eventually settled on Emily, just off to the side. Not seeking attention, not asking for it, but standing with the quiet strength that had brought her here. Cameras clicked in silence. And somewhere behind those lenses, behind the applause and ceremony to come, was the story that mattered most. The one no one saw, but everyone felt. The live broadcast reached millions, yet in that moment, It felt deeply personal, like the whole nation had leaned in, hushed, listening not with ears, but with their hearts. The president stood tall, his voice calm yet heavy with emotion. Today, he began, we do not gather to celebrate a general, a senator, or a celebrity. We gather to honor someone who reflects a truth our country often forgets, that America's strength has never been found in its titles, its towers, or the size of its bank accounts. He paused, the silence wrapping around the crowd like a held breath. Then softer now, more intimate. Our strength has always come from its people, from quiet courage, from those who choose what is right, not because it's easy, but because someone had to. He turned then, slowly, until his gaze met Emily's. She stood still, eyes wide. She hadn't known the man she'd stepped in to help. She hadn't paused to wonder whether she would be thanked. She didn't do it for recognition. She acted because her conscience wouldn't let her stand still. And somehow, in that single act, she reminded a nation what it means to be American. A hush settled again before the president motioned toward the man standing nearby. Colonel Keene stepped forward, his movements precise, his polished shoes softly crunching against the gravel path. In his hand, a small, gleaming badge, silver, meticulously engraved with the seal of the White House Medical Unit. He stopped in front of Emily, posture straight, voice strong and clear. For your bravery, he said, and for the compassion you've extended to strangers, to teammates, and to this nation, we ask you to accept this honor. His hands moved with deliberate care as he pinned the badge to her coat, just above her heart. Head nurse, he said quietly, White House Medical Wing. Emily's breath caught. Her vision blurred for a moment. The badge was cool against the fabric, but it burned with significance. A ripple of applause followed, dignified, sincere. Military leaders nodded. Cabinet members clapped. The president, without words, offered her a solemn salute. But Emily didn't lift her arms in victory. She didn't break into tears. She simply laid her hand over the badge, grounding herself, anchoring in the moment. She was still the same woman who once folded blankets in the hospital ER at midnight without anyone noticing. The same girl who had walked home in the dark, exhausted but determined, giving everything she had without ever expecting anything in return. Only now the nation had noticed, and he had stood beside her. That morning, the halls of the White House Medical Unit were quiet, organized, efficient, but there was a renewed energy pulsing through the place. Emily Daniels stood by the glass panel door, adjusting the badge on her coat. It was her first day in this new role, but everything about her presence felt familiar. The stethoscope around her neck was the same one she'd bought secondhand during her first year of nursing school. Her shoes were new, but her posture, upright but gentle, and that patient smile, the way she listened fully before speaking, those things remained unchanged. The facility was a world apart from the under-resourced clinic in Pine Hill. Here, the technology gleamed, the staffing was full, the resources abundant. But Emily walked no differently. She still tucked in the corners of hospital beds with care, still paused to ask her coworkers how they were, and waited, really waited, for the honest answer. She still carried extra crackers in her pocket for anyone who missed a lunch. The difference now, every small act of compassion came with the weight of the nation's respect behind it. She didn't need that recognition, but she would use it to reach more people, to do more good, to lead with kindness. Later that day, she sat alone in the staff break room. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds as she quietly wrote notes by hand, folding them with care. One was for a young medic battling exhaustion, another for a janitor whose mother had just received a hard diagnosis. She planned to slip them into coat pockets and lockers. No fanfare, no signature, just small moments, thoughtful acts, a heart that had always known how to care. She wasn't the kind of hero you see in headlines, not the kind who courts the spotlight. She was something else, someone who showed up, who stood up, who did the hard thing, not because it was noticed, but because it mattered. And maybe that's the kind of story we need to tell more often. If you've ever met someone like Emily, someone who gave selflessly, who stepped forward when it counted, share their story in the comments. Or maybe you've been that person, the one who offered your hand, stayed kind when the world wasn't, who kept going even when it would have been easier to stop. Tell us how you did it. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if this story touched your heart, consider subscribing for more stories that shine a light on the quiet heroes among us. People who remind us that courage, compassion, and community are the true backbone of this country. Like, comment, subscribe. Because in a world that often forgets the quiet ones, we choose to remember them. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.